Today we have Dr. Mark Lubell from the UC Davis. He is currently a professor in the Department of Environmental Policy and Science, or is it Science and Policy?
Science and Policy, sorry.
And then also co-director of the Center for Environmental Science and Behavior. He has a bachelor's degree from UC San Diego and got master's and PhD degree from political science in State University of New York, what we call SUNY at Stony Brook, and had spent a few years in Florida State, and then came back to UC Davis since, and then had become a professor at the UC Davis since 2002. This is a really important part, interdisciplinary environmental social scientist who studies cooperation problems in environmental policy using quantitative and qualitative methods. He's going to explain what that means, because I have not done it so far. And his current research topic includes water management, environmental behavior, sustainable agriculture, and behavioral economics experiments in cooperation. Again, same thing applies. He has many papers out, written, and then many grants from different agencies. And he's an expert on what he's going to talk about today. So, give you the...
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to come to speak to you. I'm obviously very happy to have a social science perspective on what's happening in the Delta and other sorts of systems. And so what is an environmental social scientist? Well, I'm actually a political scientist by training, but I've sort of thrown out that particular disciplinary identity, at least for half of my identity is sort of disciplinary, and the other half is more interdisciplinary, because I'm really interested in human behavior and cooperation problems and how that those issues play out in the context of governance and other environmental problems. So, you know, I take a quantitative approach very often that tries to understand why people are making the decisions they do in the context of governance systems, in the context of the cooperation problems that are there. I study not only water governance, but I also study, for example, farmer behavior with respect to sustainability issues and climate change and that sort of stuff. So it's that term environmental social science is sort of a term that's evolved, and you'll find some graduate programs in environmental social science now that you know, try to take anything that's useful from any discipline of social science to try to understand some of these issues. So you'll see up there my center. There's a link to my Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior, where myself and other faculty and graduate students are doing this sort of work in water and other issues. And there's a Twitter handle up there if you like to follow the Twitter feed of the center. And then also a list of my co-conspirators on this project on water management and complex governance systems, which includes some of the world's best network scientists, because we do use network science and analysis as a big part of the methodological toolkit in this. And then people from all over the world, Argentina, Australia, and other parts of the U.S., that are doing similar studies in other estuarine systems like the Delta, or just any sort of social ecological system, because we think that in order to understand how these systems work, we really need a lot of comparative research in different sorts of social ecological systems over time and space. Unfortunately, we don't have all the research we would like yet, but we're starting to make some inroads. So usually when I give this talk, I might be in like Switzerland, or, you know, I guess the last time I gave it was in Indiana, and, you know, I have to show them the map of California and point out to them the complexity of the infrastructure and the ecological systems, the hydrological systems that exist here in California. All of you in this room, and not in the room here that are coming in remotely, already know that. But on top of this biophysical system that we have is a very complex set of social and governance institutions, and the outcome of what happens in the Delta in terms of the sustainability of the resources or any of those other indicators you might be interested in is a function of not only what's happening in the biophysical system, but also in the governance system. Okay, and main thrust of the research that I'm doing in this area of research on governance is that when you look at governance, you can't just look at one institution. You can't look at just the Delta Stewardship Council or just Integrated Regional Water Management or just the Central Valley Flood Plan to understand the outcomes that are emerging from the governance system as it interacts with that biophysical system. Instead, we have to start thinking about looking at all of the different things going on simultaneously. So here's sort of an example from a piece of research I did a few years back, and a lot of the data I will show you comes from this. This is a map from the Bay Area Integrated Regional Water Management Plan, which you guys probably are somewhat familiar with. Here's another sort of collaborative forum in the Bay Area called the Bay Area Water Forum. Same map, different sort of policy venue. Here's another one, the Bay Area Joint Venture, another sort of collaborative policy venue in San Francisco Bay that covers the same geography, but also is a Fish and Wildlife Service program for trying to deal with, migratory flyways and that sort of thing. Here's another one, in a sub-watershed of the Bay Area, the Sonoma Creek TMDL, which is a policy process where their total maximum daily load, they're making decisions about how to deal with violations of ambient water quality under the Clean Water Act. So there's four. I just showed you a map of four different policy processes happening simultaneously in the Bay Area. And I did a survey in that area where I tried to find all of the people who are interested in water management in the Bay Area using IRWM lists and some other lists. And I out of all the people who I could get to answer the survey, I asked this particular question. There are many different forms and processes available for participating in water management and planning in the Bay Area. I gave them a definition of planning processes are defined as forums where stakeholders make decisions about water management policies, projects, and funding. And then I asked them to list up to 3 different things that they participated in. Most of the respondents, 58% of the respondents answered the question. Majority of them nominated 3 different institutions, different games or policy processes that they were playing in, similar to like, TMDL or the Bay Area Forum or something like that. So how many total unique different policy processes do you think that survey that I ended up with at the end of the day? So I asked all the respondents, I sort of counted up how many they nominated and tried to classify those. How many different ones do you think I got? This is an audience participation part here.
30.
Higher. About 100, 112, 116, depending on how you count. Of course, people would write in different names, different things, so I had to do some guesswork about exactly which ones they were nominating. But at least 100 different things going on simultaneously in the Bay Area around governance. When you use network science to make a picture of that, this is what it looks like. Hopefully this is all familiar to you guys in some intuitive sense, that what you have here are the blue squares. Those are all different policy processes that people nominated as things they were participating in where important water management decisions were being made. The red circles there are different actors that are participating in those processes. Some of them are survey respondents. Other ones are actors that were nominated by the respondents. So respondents might say, I participate in TMDL, and then I would ask them, okay, what other agencies and actors are in there, and they would give me a list of stuff. So I took those 2 lists, combined them, and this is the picture you get out of that. And so each blue square is a particular policy process. This is IRWM, and each of the red actors red circles indicates an actor tied to that particular policy process via participation. So a lot of policy analysis will just pick out one of these squares, right, and say how well is IRWM working, or how well is the Delta Stewardship Council working? How do we do the governance in the Delta Stewardship Council or something else to be able to get the governance right? So the work I'm doing is trying to expand that and say what we have to try to do is understand how this entire system is structured and how it functions and how different policy processes within that system can be adjusted so that the system overall is able to sort of adapt to the environmental problems that are occurring over time. Here's kind of the center of the system. The IRWMP is here. During the time, at the time, CalFed still existed as CalFed, so a lot of people did nominate CalFed, but it's interesting to think, right, CalFed sort of disappeared and has morphed into the Delta Stewardship Council and other sorts of institutions, which points out these things are sort of dynamic, right? There's blue squares coming in and out of these things, actors coming in and out of these things. A lot of these things in the center are various collaborative policy processes, like the National Estuary Program and other watershed management groups. And a lot of the actors here in the center are the big state and federal agencies, including some of the big local agencies. So, for example, EBMUD is in there as an agency that has a lot of, capacity within these systems. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's a theoretical framework that we've been working on to try to develop some hypotheses about this that sort of says, okay, here's the different policy actors. They participate. These are like your red circles. Here's the different policy institutions that they might participate in, such as IRWM, and then those policy institutions, decisions are being made about various policy issues, where it could be flooding or it could be water supply. And the point is that there's, these issues are linked. The institutions are often dealing with multiple issues at one time, and then you have to scale this up into the level, at the level of the network diagram I showed you, which is to say you got to multiply this little micro situation occurs many, many times in the overall system. Okay, so I want to, give you some specific results from some of the research we're doing here, and I want to do it in the spirit of sort of the Mars Curiosity rover, in the sense that, we have really started cracking open the Pandora's box here on the study of these systems. We're far away from having a complete understanding of how these complex governance systems sort of evolve. So I think we've kind of found some cool rocks in the research, but we really haven't sort of explored the whole planet yet. So, I'll talk about at the end, how more of this exploration should sort of occur. So the questions that that I want to talk about today, so what structural characteristics of participation in these systems might facilitate coordination? What do the networks look like? What variables influence how people perceive the effectiveness of the different institutions they participate in? And then what are some of the variables that might influence how they see the payoffs they receive? So if they participate in an institution, do they see it as providing the opportunity for mutual benefits, co-equal goals, or getting better together? Or does it look more like a zero-sum game where winners, anybody who wins means somebody else loses? So in terms of the first question, we sort of have three main hypotheses about how these systems are structured. One is that is what we say is the institutions hypothesis, which is that collaborative institutions like CalFed and the Delta Stewardship Council that take more of a collaborative, inclusive approach are sort of in the center of these networks and provide one of the main mechanisms by which coordination occurs throughout the system. Another one is the actor hypothesis, which is that there's particular types of actors that have the capacity to engage in coordination throughout the system, in particular state and federal agencies, which have a lot of resources available to them. They have financial resources, they have a lot of expertise, they have the authority of the state behind them if they want to do things like mandatory water conservation, and that provides them with capacity that gives them power to coordinate within the system. There's a hypothesis about closed network structures, which, you know, it's kind of a technical idea, but if you see a lot of closed network structures in those network diagrams, that is an indicator that there's cooperation occurring in the system. I'll just give you a little anecdote. You know, Alejo right here is a student in one of my classes, and he and I know each other, and he knows people here in the Delta Stewardship Council. If he introduces me to somebody in the Delta Stewardship Council, that closes a triangle. In network terms, that's called closing a transitive triangle. So if Alejo does something really bad in class, and I know the Delta Stewardship Council person now, I could call up that person and say, hey, you know, Alejo's done something bad in class. You might not want to hire him, right? Hopefully he'll do something really good in class, and I'll call up the Delta Stewardship Council person and say, hey, you should hire Alejo, a student out of our program who's doing great. But we can get more cooperation with those sorts of closed network structures that allow reputation to spread. Okay, so we do a lot of statistical modeling of those networks, but we start out with sort of descriptive statistics about what sorts of institutions are central in that system. And so we looked at all those blue squares and we kind of classified them according to species, if you will, the different types of institutions that are in there. And you can see there's collaborative partnerships, joint powers authority, which is kind of unique to California, various advisory committees, interest group associations like the state water project contractors, regulatory processes that people mention, and sometimes people mention like an actor, they just say DWR is a place that we make decisions. And what these results show is that with 3 different measures of centrality, that those collaborative institutions, such as CalFed and other ones that you guys are familiar with, are really most central in these networks. So they are in a place in the network that would allow them to fulfill some of the functions of coordination that they're expected to do. So that's sort of good news, I think, from the collaborative institutions. And regulatory processes, interestingly, are kind of low, you know, because they're more adversarial. They're not so much about collaboration, but they're more about kind of adversarial decision making. Joint powers authority, you know, is another thing where they're trying to get cooperation across multiple jurisdictions. Advisory committees, the same sort of thing. And then if you look at the centrality by the actor type, then the federal government, state government, as we expected, were at the top of the list in terms of centrality. And then, but also environmental special districts and water special districts. And if you take if you take interest group associations and you look at that, and you look at environmental special districts and water special districts as part of the deal, what that does reveal to you is that there's another type of cooperation that's happening within the Delta, and the Bay, which is kind of the formation of interest group coalitions. And as you know, that's where a lot of the politics comes from, where those interest group coalitions are advocating for their particular viewpoints on, you know, should the tunnels be built or other policy preferences that they're expressing over time. So within the system, we have evidence of structural evidence that there's coordination going on, done mainly by these collaborative policy venues and the agencies, but there's also coordination in terms of how the interest groups are working and different actors are working together to advocate for their preferences. So the statistical modeling, that was just descriptive statistics, but some of the statistical modeling where we use some special simulation models to simulate how these networks look like shows that there are a lot of closure in these networks that are thought to facilitate cooperation, and that closure is actually centered on collaborative institutions and state and federal agencies. So there's that's additional evidence about how those institutions and actors are facilitating cooperation within these systems. But as I mentioned, also so are the water special districts environmental groups, which means, again, there's the political coalitions are there too. In another paper, we show that those collaborative institutions also fulfill important brokerage roles, which is to say that when you look at something like CalFed, they're involved in structural aspects of the network where they are linking together different types of institutions. So they might link together an advisory committee and a regulatory institution. So to the extent that these systems are fragmented, there's a niche for those collaborative institutions to come in and try to link together some of those and fill some of those holes that that cause fragmentation. I mean, so that's all, on one hand, good news. You know, how many collaborative institutions we should have, that's a different story we can talk about later. Okay, so that was the structural story. You know, how do these things function, though? I mean, there is some link between structure and function, but it's nice to start thinking about, okay, which of these squares are more effective than some of the other ones. So we try to get some clues about the functional aspects of these systems. So this is where we bring in a more of a comparative institutional study. So in this study, and the results I'm about to show you now, the data comes from Paraná Delta in Argentina, Tampa Bay in Florida, and the California Delta. The network picture I showed you was San Francisco Bay. The results I'm about to show you came from a similar approach in the Delta itself, looking at Delta actors. Obviously, there's a ton of overlap between the San Francisco Bay and the Delta governance systems in terms of the institutions and the actors that are involved. But the important thing that we're trying to do with the comparative studies, we use the same exact survey to ask questions of the water management actors in those different systems, so that we can start to think about why, you know, systems look different in different places. And that really is, you know, in the long term, something we have to do a heck of a lot more of to understand why is the Delta different from whatever other systems that we're thinking about. And then within that, I'm going to talk about why people perceive institutions that they participate in to be more or less effective, and also whether or not they perceive those institutions to be generating conflict or cooperation. So here's kind of the logic for the empirical analysis, where what we do is we do these surveys. And so, you know, all these different actors might be survey respondents, and then we ask them, as I mentioned at the beginning, which institutions they would participate in. So we would ask them, okay, they would nominate institution one, and then the survey would say, okay, in institution one, how effective do you think it is in terms of solving problems? How fair do you think it is? Other questions about that, like that are indicators of their perceptions of how effective. And then we'd also ask them, do you think it's providing conflicts, or is it providing more mutually beneficial payoffs? So then we can aggregate across all the actors and institutions and do an analysis about, you know, what is it about this sort of, the dyad here is the unit of analysis, the actor paired with the institution to get, and these are kind of your dependent variables, the things you're trying to explain. So the first thing that the first kind of perspective is say, okay, what causes perceptions of policy effectiveness, or what is at least correlated with it? And there's a theoretical perspective that comes from institutional economics that says what you're looking at when you look at interactions within the context of one of these institutions is what are the costs of cooperation? What are the costs of having a political agreement, a transaction that enables people to find mutually beneficial solutions? So if you're trying to come up with an agreement, say in the context of BDCP or whatever it is, you have to search for all the different possible solutions. Once you sort of discover the range of possible solutions that are out there, you would bargain over what the distribution of costs and benefits that come from those different solutions. Then once some sort of agreement is reached, you would have to monitor and enforce the resulting agreement. And so you look for factors that increase or decrease those transaction costs. For example, scientific knowledge. If people are pretty confident in the science that's being provided about decision-making within the system, then they're going to have an easier time of figuring out what are the options, what are the distribution of costs and benefits that are available from each of those options, how can we best monitor things after the fact and enforce that agreement. So scientific knowledge just sort of clarifies things and helps to reduce those transaction costs. So when you look at, kind of heuristically what produces policy effectiveness, then would be a function of sort of one of the factors would be scientific knowledge. Political knowledge is another one, how well they understand the interests of the other actors involved. Participation, how much experience they have. There's a number of variables that we put into a model. I'm not going to show you all the results. I'm going to show you one of the key results. And that is that we have some interesting evidence that their perceptions of effectiveness, so we look at how, for each institution, we ask them, how well does it solve the problem? How well does it serve your interest? How fair is the institution from a process standpoint? What is your own efficacy? Does your participation in the institution make a difference? And what you see down here is that the size of these bars sort of indicates how important scientific knowledge is to predicting their views on efficacy. So you see in California, for example, scientific knowledge has and Tampa Bay, scientific knowledge has a really important effect on people's perceptions of effectiveness. One way to read that is what's going on in places like the Delta Science Program is really important. If you can create the impression through doing good science that there really is a good scientific basis to the decision making, people are going to view the overall set of decisions throughout the system as more effective and have greater buy-in to it. And this is, basically almost on all dimensions in California. In Argentina, it's not so important, but in Argentina, what's more important is their amount of political knowledge they have. So, the question there is basically saying, how well do you understand the interests of the other actors involved? That's not as important in California and Tampa Bay. Science is more important in the U.S. context. In the Argentina context, the political knowledge is more important. There's a lot of possible reasons that comparative difference could be there. We believe that one of the interesting explanations is that in Argentina, you have this situation of low institutional development, right? There's weak national institutions there, and when you're talking about water management, they keep trying things and then failing. A lot of the advisory committees would come together and then disappear, so they're very ephemeral institutions. So it's kind of like they're in a developing country like Argentina, they're in this constant process of trying to create institutions. And to the extent that is what the nature of developing countries is from a governance perspective, that political knowledge seems to be really important, right? It's like the startup cost. The political knowledge has to be there first. Once that is established, then the scientific knowledge becomes a more important thing. Another way to think about it is in California, most people involved in California water politics know pretty well what the political interests are of a lot of the different actors. So they have kind of put that issue to bed, and now they're thinking more about, okay, what does the science say, and then given the distribution of political interests, what is the science saying about the distribution of benefits and costs of different sorts of policy programs. So more of this, obviously what I would really like to have is 1,000 different studies in 1,000 different watersheds, so I could give you a scatter plot of what these sort of dynamics look like. Yeah, question?
Yeah, so on that bottom one, it looks like what you were describing sort of it's true for 3 of the 4 things. But what's going on with efficacy?
Yeah, so efficacy seems to be important in Tampa. Well, this small bar is a bit puzzling. That small bar is a little bit puzzling. I don't have a good explanation for that. I do think that it's interesting though that in Argentina, where you do see scientific knowledge, it's more in the process part. So that's another kind of like startup. The process bit seems to be a little bit more important from maybe a startup perspective. I guess, you could have a cynical interpretation and say that given how complex, yeah, you could, given the complexity and the amount of conflict, which I'll show you in the California system, that efficacy thing is kind of low because it's such a big, messy system compared to some of the other ones. I mean, you could take that interpretation, but I would say that interpretation for me would be a hypothesis that deserves a lot more testing before I would be comfortable, putting my foot down and taking that to the horse track.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
On the factor that you mentioned, I noticed that like outside of things like media into their.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, could you repeat it? Yeah, I will. I just didn't. She didn't quite complete her question. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. The slide before, when you had the factors to include policy effectiveness, I noticed media wasn't in there as an outside influence or other outside influence. How does that equate to the overall scheme?
So the way that this statistical model is built is sort of from the perspective of actors participating in each institution. So it's not. We didn't ask a question really about, to what extent do you interact with media. So we don't.
Outside of scientific, outside policy.
Yeah, we don't really have a measure of that. So that would be a candidate for a further study. I mean, I can think of some ways we might be able to get at that, but that's definitely not taken into account in this particular analysis. I mean, I guess if I had to guess that, that probably, it depends on which channels. If you kind of think of scientific knowledge and political knowledge as different channels of information that they're tapping into, the type of media they're tapping into may increase or decrease their views on effectiveness, especially some media really created seem to be a place where people who distrust science end up listening to. And that channel, I think, would probably, have a negative influence on how people would view the effectiveness of the policies. That's a hypothesis. Speculation. Okay, now what are the perceived payoffs in these games? So the other thing we do is we say, not only how do you view the effectiveness on those different dimensions, but what sort of payoffs do you see in each institution you participate? We use this exact question. So which of the following statements best characterize the typical decision processes about water-related issues in each forum that you participate in? So it's just like everyone they participate, we ask. For most decisions in this venue, most groups can gain as long as they can develop a common policy, which I like to think of as kind of a survey version of getting better together or co-equal goals. The second one is sort of a trade-off. You can find some policy gains, but there's going to be conflicts over who gains the most. This is an economist might call that Caldor-Hicks sort of side payment scheme. And then the straight-up one that's about straight-up conflict, which is for most decisions, one group's gain involves another group's loss. So zero-sum conflict where if I win something, you have to lose something. Okay, the first point that about that is, here's the answers from the 4 study sites, is when you look at how people perceive a particular institution, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So if you find 10 people that say they participate in the Delta Stewardship Council, they're going to have a diverse view on whether or not it's mutually beneficial, or are there trade-offs, or is it really about a zero-sum gain. So it's not everybody is on the same page with respect to how they perceive it. And within the middle there is showing you where there's a lot of diversity. The second point is that when you look at the breakdown of those, how people perceive those payoffs, here's what it is across the different study sites. So you can see on average, the majority of people sort of see things as mutually beneficial, which is sort of the good news. It's not like when you walk into these things that it's like I'm sure we could find some systems where this isn't the case, but in our systems, it's not like we're walking through them and everybody sees heavy conflict. But if you look at California, California has the least of the cooperation, or at least close to the bottom of cooperation, but it has by far the highest perceptions of conflict. So when you ask California stakeholders, compare them to Tampa, compare them to what's going on in Argentina, far more of them say that California is experiencing zero-sum conflicts over water management. This is from the Delta. And I think this, this pattern is going to be repeated over time, and maybe even worse now because, we did this initial study. This study actually comes from 2012, so, it's going to be potentially worse now with the drought and all of that sort of stuff. Paraná is interesting. They don't have a lot of cooperation, but they view it more. There's more trade-offs that they see there. So it's kind of like I think that's another. There's two potential reasons there that I think are my candidate reasons, and that one is sort of a developing country perspective, where again there's it's when you're beginning to develop institutions or an early stage of institutional development, those trade-offs become more important to think about. Another perspective is that there's some sort of cultural differences there between, the U.S. and Latin American political systems where they think about trade-offs as a more realistic part of what goes on in those systems. And then again, that's something that we're not sure about. We kind of have to speculate on why that difference occurs, but clearly there are comparative differences in how people are seeing things. So now, what causes people to say those payoffs? So one of the things that we do is we say within each of these games that people play, so going back to here, we kind of say, okay, within these games, how many players are in the game? How many people are playing the games? What is the diversity of the organizations in the games, using this thing called a Herfindahl index, which is a measurement of diversity, and how diverse are the issues that are being considered in the games? And when we do that, we find that, in particular, that organizational diversity is linked to having lots of conflict. So in here, high numbers mean actually it's the inverse. You got to think of it the inverse in this graph. So this is low organizational diversity. You have a lot of is where you typically have the mutual gains, the cooperation part, but when organizational diversity is high, which is the inverse of this bar, then you have a lot more conflict. And issues don't matter as much, which is, I think, interesting. So here's where you see this. I've switched how we measure diversity. So here, higher numbers mean more organizational diversity, and this is the probability that given the diversity in the game that people play, what is the probability that they select cooperative payoffs, trade-off payoffs, or conflict payoffs? And you can see as organizational diversity goes up, they're less likely to select cooperative payoffs, more likely to select conflict payoffs. So when you have an inclusive, collaborative sort of institution that brings in lots of different types of actors with lots of different types of preferences, you're actually more likely to get people saying there's zero-sum conflicts happening in those sorts of institutions, which is somewhat bad news, although we can talk about that, exactly what that might mean. But, you should expect conflict, especially at first, when you open up these processes and invite lots of sorts of institutions in.
Do you have any examples?
Well, I mean, so what people will, the classic, repeat the question. She asked, do I have any examples of zero-sum conflicts? Well, I think the classic one in California that people would perceive, I mean, it's the major, what the reality is I think open to debate, but what people perceive as classic zero-sum conflict is water supply versus biodiversity in the Delta, right? If you export more water, you decrease biodiversity, and there's no way to find sort of a mutually beneficial trade-off between them, according to some people, right? Some people have that view. Other people have a different view. Well, we can actually get both, right? We can have the co-equal goals. We can have the tunnels and the habitat stuff, or, well, now scaled back part of the habitat stuff, and get environmental benefits and water supply benefits out of it. So it's, this is where the science, I think, becomes quite important in terms of actually delineating what those possibilities are, because for sure right now there's a large amount of different perceptions about whether or not such issues are zero-sum versus mutually beneficial. No, this is what people reported. This is their own self-reports of how they perceive their participation in these programs. And by the way, the largest program in California that the most people reported participating in was BDCP. So if you wanted to take all of this and get rid of all the rest of the institutions and just focus on BDCP, you're going to see in BDCP a lot of people saying zero-sum conflicts. The other findings is another important finding here is that I'm not showing the graph here, but the more people that are involved, the more organizations that are involved also leads to more conflict. The fact that issues, the diversity of issues and the number of issues do not really have a big influence on the amount of conflict, I think is kind of good news, which is okay, if you want to think about how to structure these things, we don't necessarily have to be afraid of addressing multiple issues. We can bring in all the different ecosystem issues in the delta, and maybe we're not going to have a huge impact on the amount of conflict that occurs. In fact, there's some indicative results that when you bring in multiple issues that you might see more trade-offs. In other words, that by bringing in multiple issues, you can think about integrating across them and finding ways to link them together, like the classic example of that is conjunctive use, right? Now, instead of groundwater and surface water being managed separately, maybe if we jointly manage groundwater and surface water conjunctively, we can find some ways to increase the overall benefits. But the fact that with lots of actors and more diverse actors, you get more conflict means you really have to pay close attention to the composition of these groups. And I'm sure you guys have very often seen people say, okay, how do we get these collaborative processes to work? And one of the big things that people talk about is trying to invite people who can play well with others, right? And so there's there's a weird paradox there. They say, let's invite all the stakeholders in. We're going to invite everybody to the table. And then they sit down and say, who are we going to really invite to the table? And the answer to who we really invite to the table is the people who can play well with others and leave the grenade throwers outside the process, because if they come into the process that what they're going to do is sort of, cause a lot of conflict. So I've heard that a million times talking to people just, over a beer or something like that about how they really make decisions about who to invite. You don't capture that necessarily in the statistical analysis here, but that's an important consideration. All right, so those are kind of the three things that I wanted to point out. How are these governance systems structured? And what are some of the functional aspects of them? It looks to us that within places like the Delta and also other places, that government agencies and collaborative institutions are kind of embedded in social networks in ways that helps them facilitate coordination throughout the system, which I think is, good news from the proponents of those particular approaches. There's some evidence that scientific and political knowledge reduce transaction costs and enhance at least perceived effectiveness of individual blue squares or institutions within the system. And that varies across context, but I think that's, that should be taken to heart by a group like this where, you spend a lot of time trying to facilitate scientific knowledge throughout the system. I think that process has value in these systems, at least in places where the institutions are already, fairly well developed. And then also on the functional part, group composition, who shows up at the table is making a big difference with greater numbers of actors and more diverse actors actually being a situation where conflict is more likely to occur, which in some senses goes against what the philosophy of collaborative institutions are, which is, bring everybody to the table in order to get cooperation. There's some nuance there that we can talk about, or maybe someone would point out in the Q&A. All right, so, there's, I found that these three findings are like the rocks from the Mars Curiosity. There's some cool rocks that I think we've started to give some insight, but there's a whole ton of questions that are out there about how these systems are structured and function, how can we manage them, how can we steer these complex governance systems, engineering them, because this to me, and I'd love to hear if anybody agrees or disagrees, these messy systems are the fundamental reality of governance that exists in California and basically every watershed every major watershed in the U.S. And I think basically most major watersheds in the world are going to have some version of this happening. The outcomes of governance and environmental policy happen in this complex system. We need to know what its structure is. We need to know how it functions before we can make really strong policy recommendations about what to do. We're starting to get there, but we have a lot more to do, and especially looking over time in a place like the Delta. So I've, in email conversations that I've in dialogue around this talk, I've said to people, like, look, I'll put in a pitch for it. I would love to be able to work with you guys and set up a stakeholder survey of Delta stakeholders that we do every other year that ask questions like these and others that you might be interested in to sort of gauge how these things are changing over time. There's no doubt that this is an incredibly dynamic and fast-moving system. We've seen the Drought Task Force is a new institution that came up, for example. Those in California, we have a lot of change going on all the time. Other systems don't change. They're changing, maybe not as fast. But until we really look at a lot of systems over space, over time, comparatively, we aren't going to be able to say, very strong things about what are the factors that we should think about in terms of engineering these systems. Eventually, I'd like to get there. And I suppose if you can spend, a few, however many hundreds of billions of dollars to look at a couple rocks on Mars, then I figure, we can ask the National Science Foundation for, a couple million to explore governance systems, which are at least as important to human well-being on this planet as finding a rock on Mars. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions or debate about what you think about these systems, and thanks a lot for listening. Question over there.
What kind of, I'm sorry, the microphone. Yeah, it seems like you, going in, have to make some assumptions about politics and funding behind all that. What kind of assumptions do you make?
Well, I mean, I guess one assumption is that there is a level of the political system that we're not investigating in which all this stuff is operating. So when we're looking at like the Delta, the governance, there's kind of legislative decisions and court decisions and the structure of the administration, the agencies and the executive branch that we're really not looking at here. It's interesting when we ask people about what venues they participate, only a few people actually said like the legislature or anything like that. So there is a political environment that's outside of this network that we are kind of holding constant for the purposes of this study, but from a comparative perspective in terms of like what's happening in Argentina, that's going to turn out to be important. I think another assumption here is that people are relatively self-interested in how they're making these decisions about how to participate. They're self-interested and they have ideologies that they are paying that shape their political preferences, but they have a very limited capacity to understand the whole system. So when you look at the actual one of these red actors, some of them know a lot of the system, but lots of them are operating in a very narrow piece of the system and making decisions according to that, and they're not understanding how their decisions are spreading out to the rest of the system. That is a characteristic of complex systems that is fairly general, which I think is operating here. So it's kind of politics embedded in that sort of situation.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so you wanted somebody to talk about the nuances on the collaboration side of things and who comes to the table. And I was just wondering about that kind of fear of reprisal, bringing people into a policy game so that they don't come and sue you later or complain later that they weren't involved or something like that.
I mean, I think that's an important thing. So one way to think about the fact that, in a collaborative institution like this one, IRWM, where you're inviting a lot of people to the table, and by inviting people, you're also inviting conflict. One thing that we are not able to look at is what would happen without that institution, right? What is the counterfactual? You can kind of think of why would you ever have a collaborative institution if you're not wanting to resolve conflict? So it's, if you're going to create IRWM, would you really, one way to think of it is, would you really invite all the people who are already working well together, or would you actually invite the people who are having some problems finding agreement to try to forge agreement where conflict is currently occurring? So it's kind of like you're inviting the people who are fighting in the courts or together and saying, look, this is ridiculous how much conflict we have. It's very costly to all of us. Let's get together and try to figure out a way to solve it. So that is one possible explanation related to what Alejo is saying, which is that, people who are excluded from these processes do have other venues where they can go, the courts or another one of these blue squares or the legislature. So that's an important piece of the puzzle.
My question was similar about the actors and about the grenade throwers. And so when you're in government, you've got to be inclusive to a certain level. Some of it's required by statute, and some of it's required because there's new laws in effect that will require those particular actors and voices to be heard. So how do we get to that point? And I know this is 2012 statistics, but going forward, and a lot has changed in California policy, water, and law in the last year, especially for tribes.
Yeah. And
so that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, well, I mean, we did actually investigate, I just wrote the paper actually, whether or not people who represent government agencies are more likely to see things from a mutually beneficial standpoint. And the answer is no, so far, where you might think the government people are going to try to take this brokerage position, but they, on average, people working various government agencies are just the same as the rest of the stakeholders, which means that, of course, government agencies have these crazy things in them called people, and those people also have different ideologies and preferences that they're expressing on this survey. So, greater training and kind of have among government employees about their brokerage roles, about, trying to deal with multiple stakeholders might be something that can, be useful in this context. I know some people have gone through such trainings, but, that sort of stuff might help, and conflict resolution facilitation could help on a more widespread basis, so that your kind of line biologist or whatever, who's never ever thought about that stuff might be able to think, not only am I a biologist, but I also need to do the job of brokering among multiple stakeholders with conflicting preferences.
Hi, I just was thinking about kind of a qualitative difference among some of those processes. I think some of them draw people because there's a chance to get money out of it. If everybody gets their project into a larger plan, so they have that incentive to come to the table, and the only conflict is I might not get funded and you get funded, but it's not necessarily something that goes against my ideology. Whereas you have other processes where people are inherently drawn to a conflict, and they're entering not because they think they're going to necessarily get money, but because they are wanting to support or oppose a decision that's being made.
Yeah.
So it seems like you have pretty qualitative differences between those types of processes.
I would agree. One of the next steps that we want to do here is get into some more fine, nuanced descriptions to classify these different institutions in terms of what their characteristics are. We've done some of that and not been entirely successful so far, because it's really messy to try to go and code all the types and say how much of this is about funding, how much of this is about a regulatory decision-making and stuff like that. There's a lot of them are mixed, right? There's money available and there's also regulatory stuff going on, and so it's kind of hard to do, but I think you're exactly right. You know, once we figure out how to measure some of that stuff and get them into statistical models, my prediction is that the money ones are going to have more people kind of going to it thinking we can get some benefits out of it, and the more regulatory or kind of policy decision ones are going to have more conflict. I think your hypothesis is, I would be surprised if that was not correct. But we haven't, you know, tested it yet. A lot of untested hypotheses.
Any more questions? Giving you one more opportunity. For $5? Oh.
So a lot of these games are played by people who are paid to play them. They're people who can afford to go to meetings during the day and so forth. And so a huge number of interested parties are unaware of the games, not involved in the games, and yet deeply affected by them.
Yeah.
How does that impact the effectiveness of these institutions?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you see evidence of that in the fact that, you know, who are the central actors in these games are, you know, the professional bureaucracies, and some of the interest groups are not. And, you know, I think that those are unmeasured aspects of the system that, you know, if you could take that all into account, if you got all those people to answer the survey, if you were able to measure the preferences, I think you'd see even more conflict than what we're seeing here. So that, you know, to the extent that these measurements of conflict or perceptions of effectiveness are indicative of or diagnostic of what is actually happening to their social, economic, and environmental welfare measured by, say, exposure to water quality, I think that, you know, the system is less effective by not trying to have ways to include it. And yeah, but to really get at that, you know, nobody's yelled at me so far about the fact that, you know, all we're dealing with here in this study is the perceptions and views on payoffs. We don't really have the other part of the ecological system here, which is what is going on with water quality and that sort of stuff in different locations. That's another very important frontier to be able to get at the effectiveness question. But we know, especially in places like the Delta, that the actual ecological and social environmental outcomes are very dynamic and change over time. So, you know, to be able to look at this system and say, this blue square led to 5 less delta smelts or 5 more delta smelts or whatever it might be, is going to be you know, can't do that in this study. I mean, in the long term, if we have lots of dynamic data of both ecologically and social, then we might be able to have a more than a speculative answer to your question.
Okay, Dr. Lubell had agreed us to stay a little bit longer, so if we have a follow-up questions, stay behind, and we can better sit down and talk rather than, he's been standing over an hour. So let's give a big hand to him.
All right, thank you.